This is Securing Success, where we get to know the professionals that make up the cybersecurity sector. Today, we're talking to Mark Bartig, founder of MCB Revenue Consulting. I've known Mark for over a decade. He's been successful ramping early stage startups and knows firsthand the challenges facing founders in a hyper competitive space like security. So now with MCB, he's advising founders on developing sound go to market strategies. And from where I sit, go to market execution is a major point of failure for cybersecurity startups. So, Mark, I'm pretty excited to dive into this topic.
I'm excited as well.
Excellent. Excellent. Before we jump into MCB, and I do want to talk about that, I really want people to understand the experiences that form your opinion, right? So give us an understanding of when did you transition to the startup world and how'd that happen?
Yeah, that's a great question. It was really a recruiter reaching out to me out of the blue. I was working for a privately held company here in St. Louis doing really well. And I got a phone call about a company that was getting ready to start, and they were looking for somebody to help them grow the revenue. It's a company called Neturian. And it sounded interesting to me. I hadn't done a startup. I've worked for Symantec for about 12 years, ran a business as large as up to $500 million of ARR for them. And I wanted to see what it looked like to start very early stage and build a business. So I joined a company called Neturian. I ended up being the CRO for them, so I ran sales and marketing for the company and took the company from under $1 million in ARR to over 30 in about 5 years. Did a couple acquisitions, a SIM software company that we created one of the first MDR platforms in the industry. Took it to the MSP world and actually created one of the top 25 MSSPs in the world in about 15 months. So it was a really cool, fun experience. And I think one of the things that really excited me about it is in large companies like Symantec and others, you're very siloed into a very specific function. And one of the things that you get working with startups is you get the ability to touch everything in the company. So it's a really quick education on how every piece and part of the organization works together to drive revenue and produce product.
So you went from Symantec, 500 million ARR business to very small $1 million startup. I mean, how would you characterize that transition?
Well, it's a huge change, right? You go from having resources available to you for just about everything that you do in the selling function, whether it be enablement of your field, you have multiple marketing functions, whether it be field channel. You just have so many resources in a large company that are available, and you're known. So when you pick up the phone and call someone, they've heard of Symantec, they know who you are, they're probably using some form of your product today. Versus in the startup world, you're pretty much coming in cold, you're coming to the market, nobody's heard of you. So your value prop is a lot more important in the conversation. And I think it's important too to realize that you have no resources, you're doing it yourself. In fact, I've always been the first boots on the ground, so I'm always the first sales rep. And I do that intentionally, Mark, because it allows me to understand the motion before I hire people. And it also helps you hire the right people, because if you've got a 12-month cycle for a selling cycle, you don't want to hire somebody that's experienced in 3-month or 18-month sales cycles. They'll fail. You really need somebody that understands how to work that 12-month cycle. So it's definitely a very complicated change going from a large company, lots of money, lots of resources, to one where every dollar matters, and you're doing it all on your own. I used to call myself the chief bottle washer for the company because that's what you end up doing in a startup. That's one of the jobs.
So I've talked to a lot of people at relatively established organizations that say, I want to try a startup. And I challenge every single one of those individuals on that for the exact reason that you just mentioned. And a lot of people think they can do it. Some people make it, some people don't. Is there a characteristic or maybe a game plan for that transition that's out there? How do you tell people whether they are ready or capable of moving and making that transition?
That's a really hard question to answer because it is individual. It is not what you've done in the past. It really revolves around the individual and what they're willing to do. Some people don't have a lot of fight in them and they just don't want to go put the time and it takes to build those relationships without brand equity. And that's the first thing I always say is you've got to hunt. If you're in sales and you're in a startup, you are a hunter. if you're getting all your leads from inbound from the company that you don't go to a startup, because you will not get inbound. In fact, at the last one I was at, Binalize, which is a great company, great product, we just didn't have the marketing budget. And so every deal that we found was outbound prospecting. There was 0 inbound leads that came in because the money wasn't there. And so the first thing I would say is you got to be willing to prospect if you're going to be in sales. And it's easy to say you're going to prospect, because maybe to you prospecting in a large company is not really prospecting, because they know who you are. They're probably using your products. They know somebody in your company. Prospecting in a startup, nobody knows you. Nobody's heard of you. You've got a minute, maybe 2 minutes to share your value prop and find out if they have a little bit of pain that you call. But that's basically what you're doing is prospecting. The second piece of it is the product's just not always ready, right? And that's just the reality of a startup. An MVP, or a minimal viable product, is just that. It's minimum viable product. And so a lot of conversations you're having are going to be around, well, the product needs this or the product needs that, which is great, because if you know what you're doing, that's what you take back to the product team and you build better product from. But if you're a sales rep and you're used to everybody loving the product, it's really hard to have to go start the conversation and find out, well, you have these 3 gaps, come see me when they're full, when they're filled or corrected or fixed. And so that can be very hard for sales reps that aren't used to that.
And you're talking about sales reps, but I got to imagine even coming in at a VP or CRO level, you're coming in early enough. You're doing prospecting too.
Yeah, I mean, you're pretty much the lead sales rep if you're coming in very early. And again, if you've been a CRO and you've had a lot of resources at your hands, and then all of a sudden you're the first sales rep on the ground, again, you're doing things that you don't normally do in your job, like picking up the phone and prospecting. At Resilient, I joined them in stealth, and they didn't even have a product completed yet. We didn't have an MVP, and these guys are just brilliant technologists. And then what I did is I spent the first 6 months just going CISO to CISO, pitching the idea and helping them hone what the product needed to look like. So it wasn't even selling. We were just trying to figure out what the market needed with the technology. And we went from runtime security to vulnerability validation. So you can kind of see that whole process went through it. Wasn't a sale made until we actually built the product. So, when you're joining startups, you're going to be doing a lot of different things that you maybe didn't expect to do if you work for a larger company.
That is good insight. How many startups? You mentioned 3 just now. Have you been part of 3, or have there been a couple more?
So I did one early in my career before I joined Symantec. It was a really cool startup here in St. Louis. I actually ran the St. Louis market for them. And we were shooting broadband over against other buildings, and then VLANing the broadband into the actual offices so that we could bypass the local loop. This is when you still had T1s, I think is what they were called. The world's changed so much now. You get more power out of a cellular bandwidth than you would off of that. But it was a pretty cool startup. We just ran out of money, like everything. It's all about the money.
Sure is. And that's why funding is such a big part of it. That's why we track that. And on that note, in tracking startups, there are thousands, right? I mean, do you agree with that? Thousands of cybersecurity startups?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, and there's probably more than that we don't know for 2 or 3 years before they even start talking to the market. So who knows how many are really out there when you think about that.
Yeah, and so, putting down the exact number aside, I mean, I've heard 2,000 to 7,000. So it's hard to really come up with an exact number, but there's a lot. We can all agree on that. From what I see, and I think it's just agreed across the board, there are relatively few notable exits, right? So I'm not talking fire sales, I'm talking notable exits. Do you have an idea? Do you have a theory of why that is? What do you attribute that to?
Oh, there's so much, Mark. I mean, the first thing is, there's just so many factors. But the first thing you look at is, is there going to be a product market fit? Is there something you're going to take to the market needs, and, it solves a problem? But then you forget about just getting on the product side of it. You have product market fit. You also have to have market readiness. The market has to be ready for a change. I've been in markets where the product's amazing. The market just was not ready to adopt a new technology. And then you have product readiness. It's really great if your product works, but it has to work with others. It's got to play well, because everything in the security industry, when you look at it, it all has to interact in some way to work together for the common good of the company. And so having a product that does one thing, but it doesn't integrate with other tools, is another issue that you've got to solve. So if you can just get past that, then you've got things like the temperature of the investors and how long the founder is going to be willing to, fight for it. Because a lot of times founders just burn out. It's a hard job. You're constantly putting fires out. Sometimes you make the wrong moves. I mean, you know, it's a guesswork. A lot of the decisions you make, you've got to kind of guess, but you're using as much data as you can, but the data's not always there. And, you know, it can be as simple as a founder is focused on the solution and not the customer. That can cause one to fall apart. Or winging the sales and marketing process, because what you find early on is you're still trying to figure out what that motion looks like and what type of methodology fits in the motion. And so trying to figure out how to get that in place. And then there's hiring the right talent. You know, I mentioned earlier, you know, you don't want to hire somebody that's experienced an 18-month large enterprise sales if your sales cycle is 3 months. It just won't work. And you've got to find people that have experience in startup or have the entrepreneurial spirit that you need to bring to the table. Then you've got things like tech stacks. I mean, a lot of people don't realize, you know, when you start a company, you start with no tech stack. So you've got to have things like a CRM. You've got to have marketing platforms that outreach to customers. You've got to have communication for internal, like Slack, etc. Customer success. You have to build out effective ICPs and personas. And I could go on and on. I could talk for an hour about it. And then you get to fundraising. You've got to be able to pitch your product in a way where there are people that see value in it. And so it's just so many things that come into it that I can understand why it's so complicated to get there. And then if you think about it, you know, IPOs are great, but if you're in a B round and you can sell your company for 600 million or $1 billion, that's probably better money than an IPO. And so you've got.
And I would attribute that to a successful, a notable exit. You're selling 600 million from a B round, then kudos to you.
Yeah, exactly. So there's just so many things. Another one is if the founder's overseas, and you know the U.S. market is the biggest market, and it is the market where I believe startups have the best chance of success because a lot of the security IT professionals are willing to try new things in the U.S. where it's very complicated to get that to happen overseas. And so, does your founder understand the U.S. market? Are they spending time in the U.S. market? There's just a lot of different factors that play into a company being successful.
So you could probably whiteboard all this stuff and give some opinions, and that's, I'm sure some of what you're doing will get into that. But do you just think, and if you don't know, that's fine too, but I'm just curious because you've outlined a lot of stuff. Do you think with all that together, plus a little bit of luck required, like in life as always, is it just that we're going to see a high failure rate with the volume of startups? Is it just the nature of the beast, or can we increase the volume of successful outcomes if we follow a prescribed program?
Really good question, and I'm probably not the right person to answer it just because I've probably not done enough startups. I think that's a great question for somebody that's running a lead round or a venture capital firm that sees it a lot. I think the way startups are set up today, the most of them that I've worked for, you raise a round, you've got a seed, or you get a seed round, and you've got an initial set of investors that try to provide support, and then if you do okay and you get the money there and you do a good pitch and you can show the TAM, you can get to an A round. I think the challenge is that today I think there's a gap in the amount of available education and enablement for founders. That's the one thing I would say that's a challenge. You know, I always think, like, this is my belief, and there's probably a lot of people that won't agree with this, but if I were doing a lead round as a venture capital firm, I would probably put somebody boots on ground in the company for the first 3 to 6 months. And the reason I would do that is to assess and understand the skill set, the skill levels of all the different players in the organization, including the founder who's leading the efforts, and then build enablement plans to really make sure they're getting what they need to be successful. Today, I don't see a lot of that. If it's happening, it's just maybe I missed it. But today, a lot of times there's a fundraise, and then there's quarterly board meetings, and you kind of pitch and you start feeling each other out, and you give some advice, and the founders come back and say, hey, we're going to try this. I think there's a better way to do that. And I think there is because, founders need training in things like how to be a leader. A lot of founders haven't led before. They need to understand the sales and marketing, product development and oversight, dealing with the pressure. It's really important. So, then you talk about things like good product and the right talent are critical, and having guidance where you can bring that to the founder is really helpful. I see some of that with some of the investors, but most of them, it's a quarterly business meeting and then touching base from time to time, and you just don't see that enablement. And I think if someone from their organization was in the company for 3 to 6 months, I think they'd have a much better opinion of how to help the company grow.
So, do you have an opinion on what role that person coming from the investment organization would take on in the company for 3 to 6 months?
Yeah, I mean, from my perspective, I think it's a advisor role. Basically what I'm doing from a sales and marketing perspective, I've always wondered why there's not more investment in a company that they don't put someone in that is an expert in sales and marketing or an expert in leadership. So it could come across various different ways, but I think the key things that you've got to look at is your product fitting the market. That's a really big one, and it's the most important one. No matter what anybody says, product is the most important part of a startup because that's what's making it unique. You can look at your leadership and figure out ways to make sure that your leaders are making the right decisions and are trained properly. And then I think sales and marketing is really critical, hiring and best practices around that. And then I think fundraising. Fundraising is not putting a pitch deck together. There's a lot that goes into that no one ever sees. Like, what you've done in the past matters, but really what matters is what the forward outlook is looking to be. That's what they're investing in. And I think a lot of times it's really hard for founders to figure that out early on. So a lot of times you'll do 3, 5, 10, 20, 30, 50 presentations and you'll continually hone that presentation. But imagine if your investors could help you kind of bypass all that work, it would be really helpful. And I know they do, and I know there's a lot of investors that do help with that. I just think that there still needs to be more training in the market for the founders.
I guess there probably has to be some will from the founder perspective to take the advice, right? These are clearly very smart people, very ambitious, very confident individuals. And you need that. You can't be successful running a business if you don't have some of that. But there just has to be a realization and a willingness to take advice. I'll tell you talked a couple times now about putting best practices around hiring and talent acquisition. Clearly, that's something we do a lot. And I'm a process-oriented person. I make recommendations and try and guide and influence how they go about it. My clients do, and a lot of people listen, but some people just don't want to hear it. They just want to go with their program, and it's detrimental. So I got to imagine to a certain extent it can be an uphill battle just convincing them that they need some help or need to adopt new strategies.
I can't even imagine how hard it is for venture capital investors to do that, and I agree with you. And I think that's one of the reasons, and I'm not transitioning back to me, but it's one of the reasons why I'm doing what I'm doing, because you can find the founders doing it. When you interview for a job, you don't know if that founder is going to be receptive until you join, but when you do consulting, you actually learn really quickly that founder's willingness to look at things differently or take advice, etc. So you have a little bit more flexibility to find them and work with the ones that you know you're going to be able to help.
So let's get into that. What is MCB? What are you doing with it?
Yeah, so right now it's pretty much me cold calling a lot of small to medium-sized startups and having conversations with them. I mean, it's selling 101. I work my network. I talk with a lot of friends that are in the business. I've got friends that have some pretty successful exits and know a lot of people, so they'll make introductions. But it's sales 101. I sit down with them. I find out what their pain is that's going on in their business, and then if I can help them, I'll sit down and kind of consult with them on ways we can help grow their business. And if they like it, then we'll put a statement of work together and start working with them. But it is sales 101. You're making a lot of cold calls. You're talking with a lot of founders. Most of them have issues they're trying to solve, especially around revenue, because nobody's getting the revenue typically that they want out of their business, and I completely understand that. And so it's finding that niche where you can help them and you can bring things to the table that will bring value to them.
And so are you primarily focused on the revenue front, or what is the value that MCB overall brings to an earlier stage startup or a founder that's looking for guidance?
Yeah, I mean, Mark, I've made so many mistakes. I mean, our industry is an interesting industry because if you fail, it's really easy for people to go, hey, they failed, don't look at them, let's find somebody that was successful. But most of the startups fail. So You're going to have a lot of people out there that have made a lot of mistakes that have really learned a lot from their mistakes. And so I think the first thing I always say when I sit down with the founders, look, I've made all the mistakes that most people have. So, if you're having an issue, I can probably tell you the mistake I made and what we did to counter it. right? So I spend a lot of time just learning from founders what challenges they have. I mean, it falls into a few buckets. I mean, fundraising is a big one. Most founders, again, aren't trained in fundraising. And so just, hey, we built this really cool technology. We spent 15, 20 million on it, but we have no idea how to take it to market. So that's some kind of sales methodology and playbook. In the startup world, it's funny. You'll bring a really cool tech to the market and everybody wants to see it. And then here's how the sales call goes. Hey, this is what I do. Can I get 15 minutes of your time? Yes, we're interested. Great, we'll set up a discovery call. No, just show me the tech. I just want to see the tech. We hear that all the time.
Yeah.
And you really have to break out of that mold. It's exciting to show your tech, but I can't tell you how many conversations I've had where they said, this is the coolest thing I've ever seen. You know what you have. You've got a game changer. 2 weeks later, you call them, yeah, it's great. I loved it, but it's just not a fit for me. And you start to realize that you've got to find those prospects that have pain that your problem solves. And so you've really got to focus on that sales methodology, and it starts with a really strong discovery process, and then being able to convert that discovery into use cases, convert those use cases into pain, get a champion in the business, follow the process. And so a lot of startups just don't have that. They're just kind of out there demoing. People are getting excited about the product, and they're excited about the product. And then they get through a couple, 6, 9 months, 3 quarters, and they realize we're just not seeing the revenue from all this pipeline. And so they start looking at things like, what can we do differently? And I think that's where you bring in a really strong sales methodology and a strong sales leader. Digital marketing, the world of inbound has changed. I mean, you really have to work your socials. You have to have a very strong digital marketing plan. So I help a lot with that, hiring best practices. Pretty much anywhere they're at, I'll try to help them if I understand it. And if I don't, I'll introduce them to somebody that can.
So is there a specific size or maturity of a startup that is the ideal fit for you, right? What types of organizations would you consider in your TAM, total addressable market?
Yeah, so I like early stage. So I like seed and A. That's kind of where I've cut my teeth. And the startup world's very different, A to B, B to C, than it is C to A. And so I've found that that's where I really enjoy it. I don't know if it's my biggest strength. I mean, I've run some really large sales teams, so I can scale. But where I really enjoy doing this job the most is working with founders that have just taken their MVP to market, and they're trying to figure out their motions. They're building their tech stacks. They're going to be looking to raise that next round. They're trying to get their first initial 2 or 3, marquee clients on the board that will help them with that round. They need a good, strong digital marketing plan, kind of back to what I was talking about. That's the area I really enjoy. And I haven't really talked with anybody outside of that area, but I've talked to a lot of companies in that space.
Well, you're in a good spot. So when we did our quarterly or our second half report for cybersecurity funding, 55% of all funding rounds went to seed and Series A organizations. So there are going to be people who need your help. You and I, we chatted a little bit before you dove in with both feet into MCB. You had some options for some leadership roles. I'd love to understand, because we didn't talk about what went into the decision. Why did you decide to take this track at this point in your career?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I've been thinking about it for a couple of years. One of the things that I do on the side is I advise different companies. I'm involved with Arch Grants, which is St. Louis venture capital arm that kind of helps build new companies in the St. Louis area. And one of the things that I realize is, when you interview for a job, a lot of 5, 10 jobs at a time, and you kind of pick the one you like the most, and then you go work for them for 2 or 3 years, and maybe it's a really great experience. Maybe it's a challenge. You never guaranteed a perfect experience. I've done 2 startups that I really loved. I loved the leadership. I loved everybody in the company. But what I found was I was spending 2 and 3 years at a time with them, finding out that it's just not going to go there. And I'm at a point in my career where I want to work with companies where I think they really have potential. And one of the things this allows me to do is really spend a lot of time with founders and understand their business without having to commit to a quick process to interview for a job, right? If you think about it, the interview process, you've got maybe 2, 3, 4 weeks to make a decision if they want you. You can't just kind of say, well, let me spend a couple weeks with you learning about your business first. That just doesn't happen. In the role I'm in now, I can actually spend 2 months, 3 months. There's companies I've been talking to for months and just going back and forth with them. And I'm really getting to understand what makes the founder click. I get to know some of their board, some of their investors. I get to see, what's going on with their product in the industry over not a week or two, but over a couple of months. And what I find is it allows me to have a much better opportunity to work with people before I realized it just wasn't the right fit. The other nice thing about it is it gives you the ability to help a lot of people. There's a lot of founders out there that just don't have any money. And, it does give me the flexibility if I want to do some pro bono work for them as well. And, there's no conflicts with my current company, et cetera. So that's kind of what made me get into it. I wasn't sure. I called a venture capital firm that I knew really well, and I talked in the past, said I'm thinking about doing this, and they gave me 3 other companies like within 5 minutes to talk to, and then I was like, okay, this is probably going to work, so I'm going to try it and go for it. And I've probably talked to maybe about 20 different startups since I started doing this a couple months ago. And I've got several that I'm working with right now with the flexibility of getting to choose and pick, those companies I think I can help the most.
I can relate. Let's say roughly 20 founders, stakeholders in these organizations. How receptive have they been? I'm sure you do it tactfully, but in these situations, sometimes you gotta criticize a little bit about what they're doing. How receptive have they been to the constructive criticism maybe that you provide and the guidance that may be taking them in a different direction than they thought they'd have to go?
Yeah, that's a good question. Okay, when I started doing this, just being very transparent, I have a playbook and I have a really good understanding of sort of the bones of what it takes to build a really strong sales organization. So my thought was, well, I'll sit down with them, I'll ask them what their pain is, and I'll tell them all the things I can fix. That didn't go over very well, to be honest with you. I think, this is their personal life. They put everything into it. And I learned really quickly, the most important thing I can do is not consult them and tell them what's wrong with their business, but to listen to where their pain is and the things they're struggling with. And so I went from, why don't you try this? Why don't you try that? To what's your pain? And, here's what I can do to help you. And let's put this together, not me telling you what you need to do, so that we're in agreement. So now when I rewrite it before I even put any pricing to it, because I think it's really important for them to have an understanding of what they need. I always remember I was meeting with the founder and I asked them what their ICP was, and they said, well, we focus on all the companies that no one else focuses on. And, that's a great ICP, but it's really hard to find any kind of data source that will show that to you. So we were having a conversation on trying to define that, and it was very frustrating for the founder because that's what they want to focus on. And so how I would have probably done that different is, well, let's go see if we can find some resources that can help us discover who those clients are, because that's a very narrow ICP, for example. But you just have to kind of listen and provide as much support, and then once you get in there, you can really help them.
And I don't know how far you've gone. This is relatively new, this venture of yours, but are you tracking execution of the plans that you've laid out? Are you involved in that? Or do you provide the guidance and it's up to them to figure it out?
Yeah, there's 2 mindsets in the consulting industry. I don't have a number, that's your number, I'm going to help you get to it, but I don't own it. And then there's the mindset of, let's put KPIs around the SOW. I'm on the KPI guy because that's who I am, right? I've always run things off of numbers and KPIs. And so, if it can be measured and inspected, I think it needs to be measured and inspected. And so I'm more than willing to put that into an SOW. If it can't be measured and inspected, then, there's no point in having that KPI. So yeah, I do that. The one thing that, obviously is a lot different when you're consulting versus when you're actually working with somebody full time is that, you're a little bit far removed from some of those decisions. So if you're going to have specific KPIs, you need to have the ability.
Okay. Just to switch gears here, to you, Mark, you're obviously successful sales leader. You can be consultative to founders. Clearly, you've made some strides really quickly in your business, but starting a business on your own, that's not easy. How's that experience been, right? Just like you said, these organizations need CRMs, they need comms, et cetera. You've probably had to implement a lot of this stuff. How's that been?
Well, it's pretty easy because I've done it all multiple times for startups, so I kind of know what to do. But I've also kind of grown up in the world of build it as you need it and don't just go spend it because you're going to need it. And so, for me, it's an iterative process. It's not a let me go build all this and then start. So I started without anything, and I'm kind of building things as I need them. I think the biggest thing is if you're going to do something like this, you got to make sure you have the funds to support it so you can do the build process. There's no point in going broke and not being able to feed your family and saying you have a company when you're not making any money. And so I think it's important that you buy yourself time, as you know, as an entrepreneur. So for me, it took a point in my career where I knew I could actually retire if I wanted to before I did this, because I wanted to make sure I had the finances to not put my family at risk. I mean, I've got 2 boys in college, and starting a company with 2 boys in college, if you don't have the financial security to do it, can be a really stressful situation. And then I think for me, just having a playbook already built, so I'm not coming into this trying to create everything. My product is basically all the things that I've made mistakes of in the past and learned from, and created playbooks and processes around. So it's a little bit easier because I already have that product and built into the things I've done in the past.
So you came into this confident, you know what you're doing, you know how to run a business, it's clear. Was there anything that surprised you though? Anything you're like, whoa, didn't see this coming?
Yeah, I think a couple things. One, I didn't really think about the fact that I got a prospect and cold call all the time. I thought, and this is so arrogant, and I apologize to everybody listening, but I thought, once people knew I was doing this, they would just reach out. But it's just not how it works. You still have to build a relationship, and you have to call people. And so I think just the amount of prospecting and the amount of, getting to know people and the amount of conversations I have that don't go anywhere was a little bit of a surprise. I thought there'd be a lot more, hey, I'll just lock 3 clients up quick. The other thing is just, you're having to choose them and they're having to choose you. And that was a big change for me as well. Like I mentioned earlier, when you're interviewing, you really don't get to know people that well. So you can tell pretty quickly where there's just not going to be a culture fit. And that surprised me a little bit. I can bring value, but maybe it's just not going to be received well, or we're just not going to get along. And I've had companies like that where in a culture fit. So I think that's one of the things that was a bit of a surprise to me. The other thing that was a little bit of a surprise is what I mentioned earlier. You got to be very careful how you consult. You just can't come in and tell everybody what they're doing wrong. You really need to listen to their pain, which is sales 101, medic 101. But it's hard because you know how to fix it. You've done it. You look at it and go, oh, I know exactly what to do, but you can't just go start telling them what to do, because a lot of times that can cause strife in them and within their organization, because there's somebody that decided to do it that way, and you never know who that person is, whether it be the founder or someone they really like or someone they're ready to get rid of, and so you got to be very careful that you're not impacting people's lives that way. So that was a little bit of an eye-opener for me as well.
That's been a major learning experience for me as well, Mark. I know recruitment. I know how to set up these processes to make it successful. But, there's a lot of other things that these people are doing associated with their business that isn't related to that. And so to expect that they're going to be able to follow that to the T and give up everything else that they need to do from a time standpoint, I've definitely rubbed people the wrong way in the past. And it's something that I continue to learn how to deal with. And, okay, well, they're not moving as fast as I think they should to land these folks, for example, but they're traveling, or they're speaking, or they've got fundraising efforts, and being a consultative person running a consultancy or a service like we run, you got to understand that, and that's just part of a maturation process as well.
Your job it's an art. It's exhausting. You're hiring people that are paid to present themselves in a way that they're perfect, right? And so trying to figure out how to make the right decision in a quick time frame is very hard. So I can understand that.
So based on your experience so far, somebody asked you, a friend, family member, hey, I'm going to start my own business. What advice do you give them?
Yeah, I think if you're going to do what I'm doing and a lot of other professionals are doing, I go back, one of them closed with $1 billion exit. And he's bootstrapped a lot of startups. His advice to me was, really good advice. Is like, have $100,000. You're going to have to spend that much to just get started. And I thought that was really good advice. And I kind of lived with that until I felt like I was at a point where I could do it. You have to have a playbook. Don't wing it. And the thing I would say most importantly is listen more than you talk, and don't accept every company you talk to. Make sure it's a fit for them and for you. That's one of the things that I think is really important. It's important to get income coming in, obviously, and to show traction, but not at the expense of your well-being and their well-being. And then the last thing I would say, if you're doing what I'm doing, remember if you're coming in, someone's being impacted. Someone's not having the success they want, whether it be their sales leader, their sales team, maybe even the founder or the president. And so it's important to be humble about that, because you are impacting people's lives, whether you join both positive or in a negative situation. And, just to earn a paycheck from them at the impact of others.
Yeah. You brought up such a good point. And again, I can relate to this. When I spun off and started my own thing, Pinpoint, we had funds ready. I mean, there was definitely something to go. We had a business plan, but again, it took way longer to ramp up. And, I have very distinct, terms around what we do, especially how we recruit exclusively. And not a lot of people are used to that in this environment. But we choose organizations that want to work the way we want to work. And to be able to stay with that has been a big part of why we've been relatively successful, right? Because when you're working with organizations, just like we got to bring in revenue, and it just reeks of desperation, and things just don't tend to go well. So from my experience running my own business, starting my own thing, what you just said is critical. So I'm glad you brought that up.
Yeah, and I think it's the same thing in the startup world. I mean, you can sprint and you can change your business model every 2 or 3 months if it's not working, which there's some validity to that in some cases. But if you have a good product market fit, you got product readiness, and the market's ready, you got to play the long game. And I think a lot of companies, what happens is they start struggling, and then they just try to find business, and they start taking what I call unnatural deals, where they're gonna be heavy attrition because it's not quite the fit, but we'll discount it enough that they'll buy, and then we can say we have them and we can raise. The more important thing is get your product right, make sure your market knows your product, and grow it. But don't get desperate to the point where you're taking business that's going to impact your company. And I've seen it happen many a times where you discount way down low to take a customer, and then 12 months later they're gone, and now you're dealing with net retention issues and lots of questions of why did you sign that customer in the first place. So I agree with you, and I think believe in what you do, be committed to the process, and play the long game.
That's great, and I mean this when I say this. I truly believe the cybersecurity industry, and maybe the general startup industry in tech, needs people like you. They need services like you're willing to provide here, because if we can advance at least some of the outcomes, right? If we have a better success rate as an industry, we're going to be in a better place. The people that, people talk about the industry, it's made up of human beings. And when you see really strong talent jumping around every year, it's like, well, what happened to that guy, right? Why is that gal moving around all the time? They must have been burnt out. No, it's because companies are failing consistently, or they're failing at least in their go-to-market strategies and reshaping that. And people are going, the human beings in this industry are going to benefit. So I truly wish you success, because I like you, and I think you're going to help the industry.
If I can help someone along the way, that's even better. But I agree with you 100%, Mark. The industry needs more resources like this. I think I started by saying it'd be nice to have much more enablement for founders. I'll leave it at this. One of the things that I like to bring to the table is that just helping educate them, understanding the process, the market, the tech stacks. And I think the more education that founders can have, to your point, they're all brilliant. I mean, the smartest people I've ever worked with, the better off they're going to be. And I think you'll see more success at early stages if that happens.
Well, I'll be keeping tabs on you and MCB, and we'll probably have to do this again in the next 6 to 12 months and give us some additional updates.
Yeah, I appreciate it, Mark. It's always fun to talk to you and appreciate what you do for our industry, and keep it up. I love all the reports and all the content that you're putting out. It's really helpful. And I think it's encouraging. There's a lot of people out of work right now in the tech industry, and seeing that investors are starting to spend money again, I think that's encouraging for people. So I appreciate what you do. It's important.
Thanks, Mark. We will talk soon.